The call came at 4:37 in the morning. I remember because I'd just put the kettle on and the clock on the stove was the first thing I looked at when my phone started buzzing across the kitchen counter. My daughter's name lit up the screen, and I knew before I answered that something had gone wrong. She doesn't call at that hour. She doesn't call before 9 on a weekday period. I picked up and I heard her breathing first. Then the sound of a child shifting against fabric, and I knew she was holding my grandson, and I knew she'd been crying for a long time before she found the courage to dial. "Mama," she said. That was all. Just that one word, and my whole chest went cold. I told her to tell me where she was. She said she was at a gas station off Route 9, the one near the dairy farm with the red silo, and she'd been sitting in the car for 2 hours because she didn't know where else to go. I asked her if she was hurt. She said no. I asked her if she was hurt. She said no. I asked her if my grandson was hurt. She said no. I asked her what happened, and she said, "She fired me, Mama, from the company. She told me to pack a bag and get out of the house. She said I wasn't suited for their family. She took Wyatt's birthday party off the calendar. She said I'm not the kind of woman they want raising the next generation." I didn't say anything for a moment. I poured the boiling water into my mug, slow and steady, and I watched the steam rise. My hand didn't shake. I want you to understand that. My hand did not shake. I said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." The drive from Linden Hollow to Route 9 takes 34 minutes. I made it in 26. I didn't speed exactly. I just didn't waste time, and there's a difference. The sun was starting to come up over the fields by the time I pulled into that gas station, and I saw her car parked at the far end, near the air pump nobody uses. She was in the driver's seat with her forehead against the window. My grandson was asleep in the back, strapped into his booster, his cheeks pink from crying and then from being cried out. He was 3 years old and he looked like he'd been through a war. I tapped on her window. She rolled it down. Her makeup was gone. Her hair was up in the kind of bun women do when they've given up on the day before it's even started. She looked at me and she said, "I have nothing left." I said, "Sweetheart, get in my car. I'll come back for yours later." She moved Wyatt without waking him, which is something only mothers know how to do. She buckled him into the back of my Suburban and she got in the passenger seat and she folded her hands in her lap and she looked straight ahead through the windshield like she was watching a movie nobody else could see. I started driving. I didn't go home. I drove the back roads, the long way around, past the apple orchard and the Methodist church and the abandoned filling station with the rusted sign. I let her breathe. I let her sit with it. After about 15 minutes, she started talking. She said her husband hadn't come home the night before. She said his mother had shown up at their house at 10 p.m. with a man my daughter had never seen, who turned out to be a corporate attorney, and they had given her a letter. The letter said she was terminated from her position at the family firm, effective immediately. It said she was to vacate the residence, which was owned by a trust under her mother-in-law's control, by noon the following day. It said her access to the household accounts had been frozen. It said any custody arrangements regarding her son would be handled through proper legal channels and that given her, quote, unstable emotional presentation, end quote, supervised visitation would be the appropriate starting point. My daughter said, "Mama, she had it all typed up, like she'd been waiting." I said, "I expect she had." She looked at me then, really looked, and she said, "You don't seem surprised." I told her I wasn't. I told her I'd watched that woman, my daughter's mother-in-law, work that boy of hers for 3 years. I'd watched her cancel Thanksgiving twice. I'd watched her tell my daughter at the rehearsal dinner that her dress was, and I quote, brave. I'd watched her smile too wide at me at the christening and call my house adorable, which is what a certain kind of woman says when she means small. I'd watched her son, the husband, watch his mother do all of it and never say one word. I said, "Honey, what's her name again?" "Officially, I mean, the full one." She said, "Constance Wexley Atherton." I nodded. I knew the name. Of course I knew the name. Constance had been signing it on charity gala programs in this state for 40 years. Her late husband had built a real estate empire out of strip malls and mid-tier office parks, and then, in the last 15 years of his life, He had pivoted everything toward boutique hospitality, luxury inns, vineyard resorts, that kind of thing. The crown jewel was a renovated 80s manor up on Hawthorne Ridge that they'd turned into a destination hotel called the Wexley House. It had a 5-star rating in every magazine that mattered. Brides booked it 3 years out. Senators got married there. What my daughter didn't know, what her husband didn't know, what Constance Wexley Atherton herself did not know, was that the 86 acres surrounding the Wexley House, the land that gave that place its view of the valley and its private hiking trails, and its sense of being a hidden estate, was owned by me, had been owned by me for 31 years. I'd bought it from a man named Calloway right before he died, paid for it in 3 installments with the money my own mother left me, and I'd held it through 2 recessions and a divorce. I leased it to Constance's late husband in 1998 on a long-term agreement with very specific terms. He'd negotiated like a shark, and I'd let him think he was winning because the lease wasn't the point. The lease wasn't even the prize. The prize was the renewal clause. The renewal clause was mine. Constance's husband had died in 2019. Constance had inherited the hotel and the operations and the staff and the reputation. She had not, near as I could tell, ever read the underlying land lease in full. She had assumed it was perpetual. It was not. It was a 30-year agreement with a renewal contingent on the express written approval of the lessor, and the lessor was a private holding company registered in my maiden name with my attorney listed as point of contact. The original term was set to expire on April 14th. I had been quietly preparing for that date for the better part of 2 years. But I hadn't planned to use it. Not really. I had thought, in my softer moments, that maybe we would all get along, that maybe my daughter and her husband would find their footing, and Constance would warm up the way some women do once grandchildren come, and I would extend the lease at fair terms and life would continue. I had been wrong about that. I had been wrong about a lot of things. And that morning, driving my daughter and my grandson down a county road with the sun coming up, I let myself feel the wrongness all the way through. I took them home. I made her oatmeal with maple syrup, the way she'd liked it when she was little. I let Wyatt eat cereal in front of the television, which I would not normally permit, but the day was what it was. I drew her a bath. I put fresh sheets on the guest room bed. And when she finally lay down, around 11 in the morning, with my grandson tucked beside her, I went into my office and I closed the door and I called my attorney. His name is Whitman. He's been my attorney for 26 years. And he answered on the second ring even though it was a Saturday, because that's the kind of attorney he is. I told him what had happened. I told him I wanted to begin executing on the file we'd built. I told him I wanted to do it carefully and slowly, the way you walk up on a deer, and I wanted to do it so completely that Constance Wexley Atherton would not understand what was happening to her until it was already done. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I am." He said, "All right then." The first thing we did was nothing. That sounds strange, but it's true. For 11 days, I did nothing. I let my daughter sleep. I took Wyatt to the duck pond. I cooked. I sat with her on the porch and let her cry, and then I let her stop crying, and then I let her start to get angry. Anger is a sign of returning. You should know that. When a woman starts to get angry after a thing like that, she's coming back to herself. And you don't rush it, and you don't smother it. You just let it grow. On the 12th day, she asked me what she was going to do. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said she didn't know. She said she didn't have a job, she didn't have a house, she didn't have a husband who would pick up the phone, and she didn't have any clothes besides what she'd thrown in a duffel bag at 2 a.m. I said, "You have your son, you have me. You have your name, and your name is still good. The rest of it we'll figure out." She asked me how. I told her not to worry about how. I told her to start writing things down, every conversation she could remember with her mother-in-law, every text, every email, every cancellation, every comment, every time she'd been told she didn't belong. I told her I wasn't asking her to relive it for fun. I was asking her because I needed it documented and because she needed to see in her own handwriting that she had not been crazy. She did it. It took her 3 days. She filled 41 pages of a yellow legal pad. When she was done, she handed it to me with her hand shaking, and she said, "Mama, I didn't realize." I said, "I know you didn't. They never do." Now here is what I had been doing in those 11 days of nothing. I had been getting on the phone. Not loudly. Not in any way that would draw attention. I'd been calling people I had known for 30, 40, 50 years. The county clerk who'd processed my land deed in 1994, the forester who managed the timber rights on the back 40, the state senator whose first campaign I'd quietly written a check to in 1986, the owner of the regional bank where the Wexley house did its commercial deposits, who happened to be a man named Henley, whose mother had been my best friend in nursing school, the director of the Historic Preservation Society, who'd been trying to get a particular outbuilding on my property designated as a landmark for the better part of a decade. I made these calls without urgency. I asked how their grandchildren were. I sent a casserole when one of them lost his brother. I went to a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department and I stood for the photograph in my Sunday coat. And in between, in the soft pauses of these conversations, I dropped certain pieces of information. I let it be known, very gently, that I was considering not renewing a certain commercial lease. I let it be known that I was thinking about converting the 86 acres into a private nature conservancy in honor of my late father, which would be a beautiful thing and which would also, incidentally, prohibit any commercial hospitality use on the surrounding land. I let it be known that I had been hearing some concerning things about the management practices at a certain local establishment, and while I did not want to speak out of turn, I felt the community ought to be aware. The thing about a small region, even a wealthy one, is that information moves slow on the surface and very fast underneath. By the end of those 11 days, Constance Wexley Atherton's banker was no longer returning her calls promptly. Her Preservation Society plaque, the one she'd been lobbying for, had been quietly tabled. 2 of her seasonal staff had given notice. And her general counsel, who was not a stupid man, had pulled the original land lease out of the file cabinet and had read it for the first time in his career, and he had not slept well since. But all of this was background. The real work, the work I needed my daughter for, was something else. On the 14th day, I sat down with her at the kitchen table and I told her everything. I told her about the land. I told her about the lease. I told her about my late friend Henley's mother and the senator and the forester. I told her what I had been doing in those 11 quiet days and what it would mean if I kept doing it. And I asked her, because I needed to ask her, whether she wanted me to stop. She said no. She didn't even pause. She said, "Mama, I want my son to know that women in our family don't get pushed around." I said, "All right then." I asked her one more thing. I asked her about her husband. I had been holding that question for 2 weeks because I did not want to put it to her before she was ready. His name is Bram. He is 36 years old. He is the only son of Constance Wexley Atherton, and he has spent his entire adult life working in the family business under his mother's thumb, and he has spent the last 3 years failing to defend my daughter from a single one of his mother's many cruelties. I asked her where she stood with him. She was quiet for a long time. She said he had called her 4 times since the night she left. The first call he had cried. The second call he had blamed her, said she should have been more accommodating. The third call he had blamed her, said she should have been more accommodating. The third call he had blamed his mother, said his mother had always been impossible. The fourth call he had asked her to come home and let him fix it. She said she had not answered any of them. She said she had listened to the voicemails. She said she had not been able to bring herself to call him back. I said, "Sweetheart, that's your decision to make and I won't push you. But I want you to think about this. A man who watches his mother humiliate his wife for 3 years and never says one word, and then asks his wife to come home and let him fix it, is not a man who has decided to stand up. He is a man who has decided to wait until the cost of doing nothing got higher than the cost of doing something. That isn't love. That's accounting." She looked at me. She said, "Mama." I said, "I know. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see." She nodded. She didn't say anything else that night. But the next morning, she called him. I heard her in the guest room, her voice steady. She told him she was filing for divorce. She told him she wanted full custody. She told him she would not be coming home. She told him not to call her again and to communicate through her attorney from this point forward. Then she hung up. She came into the kitchen. She poured herself a cup of coffee. Her hand was steady. And she said, "Okay, Mama, what's next?" What was next was March 28th, 2 weeks before the lease expired. Constance, Wexley Atherton, hosted the spring gala at the Wexley House every year. It was the event of the season. Senators, judges, the editor of the regional magazine, the woman who ran the largest philanthropy in 3 counties, the cardiologist who just bought the second largest home in the area. 300 people in black tie, a string quartet, a silent auction. The whole thing. I had been on the guest list for 31 years. I had never once attended. Constance had always assumed, I think, that I was intimidated, that a country woman from Linden Hollow with dirt under her fingernails could not bring herself to walk into that ballroom. She had no idea who I was. She had genuinely, truly never bothered to find out. This year I RSVP'd yes. I brought my daughter. My daughter wore a midnight blue gown that we'd had altered at a shop 2 towns over. Her hair was loose. She wore my mother's pearls. She looked like a woman who had been through something and had come out the other side, which is exactly what she was. I wore black. I wore a simple black dress and flat shoes because my knees aren't what they used to be, and I carried a small leather portfolio under my arm. Inside the portfolio was a single sealed envelope on which Whitman had typed Constance's full legal name. We arrived at 7:42 p.m. The valet didn't recognize my truck. The hostess at the door looked at our names twice. We walked into the ballroom and the string quartet was playing something by Vivaldi, and the chandeliers were lit and the silent auction tables glittered with their little white cards. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and I felt my daughter's hand find mine, and I squeezed it once and let it go. Constance saw us about 30 seconds later. She was across the room holding a champagne flute, laughing at something a man in a gray tuxedo was saying. She turned her head and her eyes landed on my daughter, and her face did a thing that I have rarely seen on a grown woman, which is to drain completely of blood and then flush back in patches, like a watercolor done by a child. She handed her champagne flute to someone without looking at them, and she started across the room. I let her come. I did not move. I let her come all the way across that ballroom, through the press of bodies and the music, until she was standing in front of us, and I could see the powder caked in the creases by her mouth. She said very quietly, "What do you think you are doing here?" I said, "I'm a guest." She said, "I am going to ask you to leave." I said, "Constance, before you do that, I think you ought to read something." I handed her the envelope. She looked at it. She looked at it. She looked at me. She did not open it. She started to say something else, and I said, "I would open it before I said another word if I were you." She opened it. It was a single page. It was on the letterhead of my holding company, signed by me and notarized that morning. It informed her with great courtesy and great precision that the land lease underlying the Wexley house would not be renewed upon its expiration on April 14th. It informed her that any structures, improvements, or commercial operations conducted on the leased land after that date would constitute trespass. It informed her that the lessor was prepared to enter into a new arrangement on substantially modified terms contingent upon certain conditions, which were enumerated in an attached schedule. The attached schedule had 3 items. 1. The immediate restoration of my daughter's full ownership interest in the residence and trust assets that Constance had moved against her. 2. A public acknowledgement in writing to be circulated to the family and the company and the appropriate parties of the wrongful nature of my daughter's termination. 3. A sum to be placed in trust for my grandson's education, payable within 30 days. Constance read it. Her hand began to tremble. She read it again. She looked up at me. She said, "You can't." I said, "I have." She said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Wyatt's grandmother, and I own the ground your hotel sits on. I have owned it since before your husband bought this property. He knew." He chose not to tell you. That's a conversation you'll have to have with his memory." She looked at my daughter. She looked back at me. Her mouth opened and closed. Behind her, a few people had begun to notice that something was happening. A woman in green silk was watching us over her glass. The man in the gray tuxedo had turned toward us. The string quartet kept playing, but the conversation in the nearest tables had started to thin. I said, "Constance, you have a choice. You can sign a schedule by Monday morning, or you can spend the next 4 months figuring out how to dismantle a 5-star hotel and relocate it. I don't particularly care which one you pick, but I want you to understand that this is the last conversation I am going to have with you on this subject. And I want you to understand that I came here tonight, in front of all of these people, because 3 weeks ago you sent a corporate attorney to my daughter's house at 10 o'clock at night to put her out on the street with her child. I wanted you to know what that feels like, the not knowing it was coming, the being in public when it arrives. That part was on purpose. She didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say. I took my daughter's arm. We turned. We walked out of the ballroom the way we come, and the string quartet was still playing Vivaldi, and someone behind us had begun, very quietly, to laugh, although I do not believe it was at anything funny. We got into my truck. My daughter sat in the passenger seat, and she put her hands on her knees, and she said, "Mama." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what to feel." I said, "You don't have to feel anything tonight. You don't have to feel anything for a while. Just sit here with me and breathe." So we sat in the parking lot of the Wexley house, with the chandeliers blazing inside and the valets confused at our car, and we breathed. After a while she said, "Do you think she'll sign?" I said, "Yes." She did. By Monday at 10 a.m., Whitman had the executed schedule in his office. The trust was reconstituted, the residence reverted. My grandson's education fund was wired in by Wednesday. The public letter went out the following week. It was, I will say, beautifully phrased. Constance has many faults, but she knows how to write a sentence. My daughter's husband signed the divorce papers 6 weeks later. He did not contest custody. He sees Wyatt every other weekend, supervised at first and then unsupervised once he completed a parenting course, which was the one condition my daughter insisted on. He is not remarried. I understand he has moved into a smaller property and has taken a reduced role in the company. I do not wish him ill. I simply do not think about him. My daughter is doing better than I could have hoped. She bought a small house 2 miles from mine. She has a garden. She has started a consulting business in her field, which is something she'd always wanted to do and had been told by her in-laws was beneath her. She does not seem to miss the world she came out of. My grandson is in pre-kindergarten, and he likes trucks, and he calls me Gigi, and he does not yet know any of the story. And I don't know when or how we will tell him, but we will tell him because I want him to grow up knowing what the women in his family are made of. I want to tell you something now before I close. I am 67 years old. I have buried a husband and a sister and most of the friends I grew up with. I have learned, slowly, what abuse looks like before it becomes the thing you can name. It does not start with the locked door or the corporate attorney at 10 o'clock at night. It starts with the comment about your dress at the rehearsal dinner. It starts with the canceled holiday that everyone agrees is no one's fault. It starts with the small, careful way a certain kind of person rearranges your life so that the only voice you can hear clearly is the voice that is hurting you. If you're watching this and you recognize what I'm describing, I want you to write it down, not to share it, not yet, just to write it down in your own hand on paper so you can see it. And I want you to call one person who loved you before any of this started, one person who knew you when you were whole. Just call them. You don't have to explain anything. You just have to remember that they exist. And if there is no one, then you call me. Metaphorically, you hear an old woman from Linden Hollow telling you that you are not crazy and you were not wrong, and the ground under their empire is not theirs. It never was. It belongs to women like you, and women like my daughter, and women like the ones who came before us and held this earth steady through worse than this. That's all I came to say tonight. Thank you for sitting with me. I've thought a lot. in the months since that night at the Wexley house about why things unfolded the way they did. And the more I sit with it, the more I believe that nothing about it was luck. Every piece of what happened was the harvest of something planted long before any of us knew there would be a harvest at all. Constance lost her hotel in the end because 31 years ago she could not be bothered to read a land lease. She lost the respect of her circle because for 3 years she had treated my daughter like an inconvenience in front of people who were quietly keeping score. She lost her son's marriage because she taught that boy, from the time he was small, that her approval mattered more than his own backbone, and a man raised that way cannot stand up when it counts. None of this was punishment from somewhere outside her life. It was simply the bill arriving for choices she had been making for decades, with her chin up and her diamonds on. And my daughter, my brave, exhausted, beautiful daughter, was able to walk out of that marriage with her son and her name intact because somewhere along the way, I had taught her something I am not sure I ever said out loud. I had taught her that a woman holds her own ground, literally and otherwise. I bought that 86 acres in 1994 with money my mother left me, and I did not buy it because I had a master plan. I bought it because my mother had told me when I was 23 years old and shaking from my first heartbreak that a woman who owns one true thing is a woman who can never quite be erased. I did not understand her then. I understand her now. There is something I want any woman watching to take with her. You are not weak because you did not see it coming. Constance is a person who has spent her whole life learning how to make her cruelty look like good manners. And Brahm is a person who learned, before he could read, how to pretend not to see her do it. My daughter was not foolish for missing it. She was kind and she was hopeful, and those are not the same thing as foolish. They are, in fact, the better part of her. The work after a thing like this is not to become hard. It is to become discerning, to keep the kindness and add the eyes. And one more thing, and then I will let you go. Strength is not a fight. Strength is the 11 days of doing nothing while you let your daughter sleep and you make the quiet phone calls and you wait for the ground to settle under your own feet. Anybody can swing. It takes a grown woman to wait. Wyatt will know that one day. I'll see to it.